3 days. That's all it took. 3 days away visiting my older brother, and somehow an entire road appeared on my property like I had slept through a government infrastructure project. When I pulled up to my land that Sunday afternoon, I actually slowed my truck down because I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. The gravel lane that had run along the eastern edge of my property for nearly 20 years was gone. Completely gone. In its place was a smooth, black asphalt road with painted center lines, shiny reflective markers, decorative landscaping, and a row of solar-powered streetlights stretching toward the entrance of a subdivision called Maple Creek Estates. Then I saw the sign, "Residents Only." I remember staring at those two words for several seconds because my brain simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Residents only on my land. Now, to understand why that sign made my blood pressure jump about 50 points, you need to understand how things got there in the first place. My name is Ethan Mercer, and I own about 40 acres just outside of town called Red Hollow. My grandfather bought the property decades ago when nobody wanted land that far from town. Back then it was mostly fields, trees, and dirt roads. By the time I inherited it, Red Hollow had started growing. Developers were pushing farther out every year, building neighborhoods for families looking for bigger homes and quieter streets. About 8 years earlier, a development company built Maple Creek Estates right next to my property. At first, I honestly didn't mind. The original residents were decent people. Families, retirees, young couples trying to build a life. Back then, the Homeowners Association wasn't some power-hungry machine. It was mostly volunteers organizing neighborhood cookouts and reminding people to bring their trash cans in. The gravel lane on my property happened to connect their neighborhood to the state highway. Using it saved residents around 10 minutes every morning. One afternoon, the original HOA president, a retired school principal named Walter Simmons, drove out to my barn and asked if residents could use the road occasionally. He was polite about it, respectful. We sat on folding chairs drinking iced tea while he explained the situation. I told him sure, as long as people drove safely and understood it was private property. We shook hands, and that was that. No contracts, no lawyers, no drama, just two adults acting like neighbors. For years, everything worked fine. People waved when they passed by. Some stopped to chat. Around Christmas, a few families even dropped off cookies at my house. It felt like the kind of community relationship people always claim they want, but rarely have anymore. Then things started changing. New residents moved in. Property values climbed. More rules appeared. More committees. More people who seemed convinced that owning a home automatically qualified them to manage everyone else's life. The biggest change came when a woman named Denise Caldwell became HOA president. Denise wasn't loud. She wasn't the type who screamed at people. Honestly, she was worse. She had that calm, polished confidence that made every unreasonable demand sound perfectly reasonable. The first time we met, she spent 20 minutes explaining why several trees near my fence line were hurting the visual consistency of the community. Visual consistency. I remember standing there wondering how a tree that had been growing longer than she'd been alive was somehow causing a neighborhood crisis. Over the next couple of years, I noticed the HOA becoming more aggressive. They started sending letters to residents over tiny issues. Mailboxes, holiday decorations, basketball hoops, things that normal people usually don't lose sleep over. Thankfully, I wasn't part of the HOA, so I mostly ignored the drama. At least I did until the weekend. Everything changed. The previous Thursday, my brother called and asked if I could help him with some repairs on his cabin several hours away. I packed a bag, locked up the house, and left early Friday morning. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just a normal trip. When I came back Sunday, the road had been transformed. What shocked me wasn't just the construction itself. It was the scale of it. This wasn't a crew filling potholes. This was a full-scale paving operation. Survey markers, street signs, curbs, landscaping. Somebody had spent serious money turning my private access road into what looked like an official neighborhood street. I got out of my truck and walked the entire length of it. Every step made me angrier, not because of the road itself. Honestly, it looked great, better than my old gravel lane ever had. What made me angry was the assumption behind it. Nobody called. Nobody asked. Nobody knocked on my door. Somewhere along the line, somebody decided they no longer needed permission. By the time I reached the subdivision entrance, I already knew exactly where I was going the next morning. And as I stood there staring at that residence, only sign planted firmly on land I legally owned, I had a feeling this situation was about to become very expensive for someone. The next morning, I drove straight to the Maple Creek Estates clubhouse before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. The building sat near the front entrance of the neighborhood, a large stone structure designed to look far more important than it actually was. As I walked in, I passed framed photos of community events, charity drives, holiday gatherings, all the things HOAs love displaying to remind people they're supposedly the heart of the neighborhood. Denise Caldwell was already there. She sat behind a polished conference table with two other board members, reviewing paperwork like they were running a Fortune 500 company instead of arguing about fence colors and lawn edging. When she saw me, she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a guilty smile. The smile of someone who genuinely believed they had done nothing wrong. "Ethan," she said, "good to see you." I stood there for a second looking at her, wondering whether this conversation was going to be absurd, insulting, or both. As it turned out, it was both. "I just got back into town," I said. "Want to explain why there's a road built across my property." Denise leaned back in her chair like she had been expecting the question. "We upgraded the access route for the community." Upgraded, like she'd replaced an old appliance. "You paved my land. The residents have used that road for years because I allowed them to, and we assumed continuing access wouldn't be an issue." There it was. Assumed. Funny how people always use that word right after spending someone else's money or taking someone else's property. One of the board members chimed in and started talking about safety improvements, property values, emergency vehicle access, community appearance. I barely listened, because while they were talking, something else had caught my attention. A neighborhood map hanging on the wall. A large decorative map showing roads, walking trails, common areas, visitor parking, and resident parking. My eyes stayed on it longer than anyone realized. Then I thanked them for their time, turned around, and left. Denise actually looked surprised. I think she expected an argument. Maybe a threat. Maybe a lawsuit. Instead, I walked out completely calm. That calmness made her uncomfortable, though she didn't know why yet. The truth was, while she was busy explaining why they paved my road, I had noticed something far more interesting. The road wasn't the valuable part. The parking lot was. About a quarter-mile inside the neighborhood sat a large shared parking area used by residents with multiple vehicles, guests, contractors, and overflow traffic. I knew the lot existed, but I had never paid much attention to it before. After leaving the clubhouse, I drove directly to the county records office. By noon, I was looking at maps. By 3 o'clock, I was looking at surveys. By 5 o'clock, I was smiling. Not because I enjoyed conflict. Honestly, I hate conflict. But there's a certain satisfaction that comes from discovering someone else's arrogance has created a problem far bigger than they realize. The survey confirmed everything. Not only had they paved my road, but the entrance road, decorative sidewalk, landscaping strip, security sign, and nearly the entire overflow parking lot sat on land that legally belonged to me. Apparently, years earlier, during construction, somebody had made assumptions about property boundaries. Then more assumptions were made. Then more. Until eventually everyone simply accepted fiction as fact. The problem with fiction is that reality eventually shows up. Over the next 48 hours, I made several phone calls. First a survey company, then a property attorney, then a towing company, then the county sheriff's office. Every step was done carefully. Every document reviewed twice. Every legal requirement checked and rechecked. If I was going to move, I was going to move correctly. Wednesday morning arrived bright and clear. Around 7 o'clock, the survey crew started marking property boundaries. By 8, temporary fencing was being unloaded. By 9, a sheriff's deputy stood nearby observing everything. That's when residents started noticing something was happening. People walking dogs stopped and stared. Joggers slowed down. A few homeowners gathered in small groups whispering. Nobody understood the full picture yet. Then the tow trucks arrived. 4 of them. Big ones. The kind that instantly make people nervous. I still remember the expression on the first resident's face when he walked toward me carrying a coffee mug. "What's going on?" he asked. "Private property enforcement," I said. He laughed because he thought I was joking. I wasn't. The first vehicle was hooked up shortly afterward, then the second, then the third. Once word started spreading through the neighborhood, chaos arrived right on schedule. My phone began ringing constantly. Calls, texts, voicemails. Some confused, some angry, some threatening. One resident screamed so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Another informed me that his brother-in-law was an attorney, as if that fact alone would somehow alter county property records. Meanwhile, the tow operators kept working. Methodical, professional, one vehicle at a time. By late afternoon, the parking lot looked abandoned. Empty spaces stretched across the pavement. The same pavement that technically belonged to me. Around 5 o'clock, Denise finally arrived. She came speeding into the lot in a black SUV, jumped out before the vehicle was fully parked, and marched straight toward me. I've seen people angry before. I've worked construction. I've dealt with contractors, suppliers, and county inspectors. But Denise was operating at a special level of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Managing my property. You're towing residents' vehicles. Relocating vehicles from private land." Her face turned red. "You can't do that." I handed her a folder. Inside were certified surveys, ownership records, photographs of the paving project, county maps, and legal notices. She opened it confidently. By the third page, her confidence started fading. By the 10th page, she wasn't saying much. By the end, she looked like someone who had just discovered the floor beneath her house belonged to somebody else. "This can't be right," she said quietly. "Unfortunately, it is." One of the board members arrived shortly afterward. Then another. Then, before sunset, an attorney representing the HOA appeared. That meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Most of it consisted of people realizing how badly the situation had spiraled. The attorney asked questions. Lots of questions. Who authorized construction? Was permission obtained? Were easements recorded? Were agreements signed? Every answer seemed to make the room more uncomfortable. Because the truth was embarrassingly simple. Nobody had asked. They assumed. The same assumption that started the entire mess. By Thursday morning, the story had become the main topic of conversation in the neighborhood. Residents gathered in driveways discussing it. Social media groups exploded. Some blamed me. Some blamed the HOA. Some blamed both. A few people actually stopped by my property and apologized even though they personally had done nothing wrong. One elderly couple brought homemade muffins and admitted they had always suspected the HOA board was overstepping its authority. I appreciated that more than they probably realized. What most residents eventually learned was that I hadn't seized anybody's cars. The vehicles were secure, documented, and stored on another section of my land. Owners could retrieve them after signing acknowledgement forms and paying relocation fees. Inconvenient? Absolutely. Illegal? Not even close. The more lawyers reviewed the situation, the clearer it became. The HOA's position was collapsing. Every document pointed in the same direction. Every survey confirmed the same boundaries. Every photograph showed the same unauthorized construction. By Friday afternoon, the board scheduled an emergency meeting. That's when Denise finally called and asked if I would be willing to discuss a resolution. The confidence she carried earlier in the week was gone, replaced by exhaustion, maybe even embarrassment. I agreed to meet because, despite everything, I wasn't interested in destroying anyone. I simply wanted them to understand a lesson they should have learned before the first shovel touched the ground. And as I walked into that meeting later that evening, looking around at nervous board members and anxious attorneys, I realized they were finally beginning to understand exactly how expensive their little improvement project had become. I walked into that emergency meeting expecting a fight. Instead, I found a room full of people who looked like they hadn't slept in days. The board members sat quietly around the table. Their attorney had several folders spread out in front of him. Denise looked older than she had a week earlier. Funny how reality can age a person faster than time. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The confidence that usually filled those HOA meetings had vanished. There were no speeches about community standards, no lectures about improving the neighborhood, no talk about property values, just silence. Finally, their attorney cleared his throat and got straight to the point. Mr. Mercer, we'd like to discuss a long-term solution. I almost smiled when he said it. A week earlier, they hadn't wanted a discussion. They wanted control. Now, they wanted a solution. Amazing how quickly priorities change when lawyers start billing by the hour. We spent the next several hours negotiating. Not arguing. Negotiating. Because by then, everyone understood the facts. The surveys were undeniable. The ownership records were undeniable. The construction history was undeniable. Their options had shrunk dramatically. They could attempt a lengthy legal battle they were unlikely to win, or they could make peace with reality. Around midnight, we reached an agreement. Maple Creek Estates would sign a formal lease for the road, parking lot, entrance area, and associated improvements. The HOA would pay monthly rent. They would cover property taxes associated with that section of land. They would reimburse every expense related to the surveys, legal filings, towing operations, storage costs, and enforcement actions. They would also acknowledge in writing that the property remained under my ownership. No tricks, no loopholes, no creative interpretations, just clear language everyone could understand. When the final documents were signed, I remember looking over at Denise. She looked defeated, but not because she lost money. She looked defeated because she finally understood the mistake. This whole situation had never been about asphalt. It had never been about a road. It had been about entitlement. Somewhere along the way, the board convinced itself that years of access had magically transformed permission into ownership. They stopped asking because they stopped believing they needed to ask. That's a dangerous mindset, whether you're running an HOA, a company, or a country. The following Monday, I opened the gates and began releasing vehicles back to their owners. Most residents were surprisingly reasonable. Some were frustrated, which I understood. A few apologized. Several admitted they had been uncomfortable with the HOA's behavior for years, but never wanted to get involved. One man shook my hand and said, "Honestly, somebody should have stood up to them a long time ago." What surprised me most was how many residents seemed relieved that the board had finally been forced to face consequences. The people living in those homes weren't villains. Most were hardworking families trying to live their lives. They weren't the ones who paved my road. They weren't the ones making decisions behind closed doors. They simply got caught in the blast radius of leadership that forgot where its authority ended. Over the next few months, things slowly returned to normal. The road stayed open. Residents continued using it. The parking lot remained available. Life moved on, but the atmosphere changed. The HOA became noticeably quieter. Suddenly, board meetings focused on actual neighborhood issues instead of power plays. The endless stream of complaints seemed to disappear. Funny how that works. Every now and then, I drive through that area on my way into town. The road still looked great, better than anything I would have built myself. The landscaping matured. The streetlights glowed softly at night. The decorative entrance sign remained exactly where they'd installed it. Visitors probably assumed the neighborhood owned everything they saw. In reality, every tire rolling across that pavement was crossing property that belonged to the guy they tried to ignore. Sometimes I'd stop near the entrance and think about how differently everything could have unfolded. If someone had knocked on my door and asked permission before construction started, I probably would have agreed. We could have worked out a lease. We could have signed paperwork. We could have shaken hands and saved everyone a mountain of stress, legal fees, towing bills, and embarrassment. But pride has a way of making simple solutions invisible. People become so focused on what they think they're entitled to that they forget the value of basic respect. The strangest part is that they actually improved my property. They spent a small fortune building infrastructure on land they didn't own, then ended up paying me every month to keep using it. What started as one of the most frustrating experiences of my life eventually became a steady source of income. Every time I pass that perfectly paved road, I still laugh a little. Not because I enjoy seeing people make mistakes, because the entire situation feels almost impossible to believe, even now. They thought they were taking something from me. Instead, they built me an asset, And that's where I'd love to hear your opinion. If you had come home and discovered an HOA built a road, parking lot, and neighborhood entrance on your property without permission, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have gone straight to court? Would you have demanded the road be torn out completely? Or would you have done exactly what I did and turned their mistake into a business opportunity? Let me know down in the comments, because even today, whenever this story comes up, people still argue about who was right, who was wrong, and whether I was justified in making every car in that parking lot disappear.